This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. You know, it's one of the funniest things to me. It seems like every time the Browns have a big win, you get a weird reaction from some of those in the national media. And I want to go back to one show that in particular that I felt like was probably the most uncharitable to the Cleveland Browns in general. It's the show with Chris Canty on it. Now, I will be fair. I do think that this week, this win did a lot to change people's minds nationally. I think that there were a lot of people who might have not been given the Browns or even like DeShaun Watson the benefit of the doubt before this game that will give it after this game, right? I heard Pat McAfee, say some really complimentary things about the Browns, even Mike Florio on NBC Football Talk in America, even on Get Up, I thought that was a real nice segment, and even Chris Sims, right? So I do think that you can gradually see the tide turning, but there are those who are still kind of locked in to what they believed in the early part of the season, or what they wanted to be true in the early part of the season, despite the fact that there were obvious signs that those things weren't true. And we know who that's been. Nick Wright's probably been somebody hard on that not anti-Browns, but just kind of, he had to take a couple weeks ago that this was the worst quarterback trade in history and that DeShaun Watson just is never going to be good again. So he's kind of dug in on it. Colin Coward, he's dug in on it. So we'll see how those guys come up, and if they say anything interesting, I'll respond to it in this format as well. But let's hear from the people who did not handle the Browns' last two big wins well. Let's see if they're able to cope with this one just a little bit better.
Than literally ever before in the history of the sport. 5 of them walk-off wins yesterday, including for the Cleveland Browns, who I guess you want to say, yeah, we have to upset the Baltimore Ravens 33-31. And now do we have to ask the question, did DeShaun Watson officially become a Brown yesterday?
Well, I'm not going to say he officially became a Brown. That happened when they gave him a $230 million contract fully.
So one of the things I want to point out, because I think a lot of people fall for this trick, and they fall for this trick not because people are dumb or anything. It's just because this is a little sneaky trick that people like to do in the media, or it's not necessarily a trick. It's just how people work, right? And I think people think that media bias is going to be somebody saying something egregious on camera. And yes, there are times where that's how media bias happens and that's how it goes on. It's just somebody saying something straight up egregious. But oftentimes when people have an agenda or a bias that they want to impart on the audience, they don't do it through saying stuff explicitly. They do it through how they frame things, the questions that they choose to ask, the narrative threads that they choose to pull, and the narrative that they choose to frame a given set of events around. A perfect example of this, we can go back to the beginning of the season, is Joe Burrow. Now, Joe Burrow struggled early in the season coming off that calf injury. But you notice the media coverage on him was not nearly as ferocious as it was with DeShaun Watson, despite the fact that DeShaun Watson at this point has lost 1 game as a starter this season, while Joe Burrow had lost 3. So how was that framed differently, right? DeShaun Watson was framed as, when's he going to show up? He's a $230 million man. He has to get through all of this. He has to get better. He has to not be injured in all of that, right? That's how it was framed when it was DeShaun Watson. Now, you move somebody like Joe Burrow into that same spot or a similar spot, all of a sudden it's, hey, he's coming back from a calf injury. And you know what? The numbers aren't great, but he is gritty. And he is getting this Bengals team where they need to, despite the fact that they lost 3 of their first 4 games. That's how that was framed for Joe Burrow. For DeShaun Watson, people chose to frame it as if he were a liability. Now, I'm not telling you that people are doing this for whatever reason. I'm not trying to get into all that. But what I am saying is, like, this is how media bias imparts itself. It's not by explicitly saying stuff, right? That's more to get you all excited and to engage with them, right? But it's how they frame stuff. And you notice how they're framing this question. It isn't, hey, man, Deshaun's put together some good games, and then he put together that second half versus Baltimore. Is he back? Because that's a way you could certainly frame it. No, it's, hey, did he finally show up for the Cleveland Browns? As if he never had a good game for this team until those last 2 quarters in Baltimore. The framing is so important. It's a very important tool, and I don't think a lot of people catch it and call it out appropriately enough. But people will try to impose their bias with framing. Not with by saying they'll ask these open-ended questions that aren't really open-ended because they're framed in a way to force a certain outcome out of you, to force a certain opinion out of you, right? That's how people do it. That's how media trained people will try to force you into an opinion, right? Is by how they frame these questions. And framing is just the questions people choose to ask, the narrative threads people choose to pull, the narrative threads that people choose to ignore, and how they build a narrative around those events, right? I could build a narrative if I wanted to manipulate the audience into thinking DeShaun Watson has always been great. I can manipulate that narrative by asking questions of like, hey, was this DeShaun Watson's best fourth quarter comeback as a Cleveland Brown? That would be a horribly biased way to frame that question, because that would imply that there's been more than one. This is what I'm saying, right? You can see how it can happen from one side. You can see how it can happen from the other side. But it's about the framing. And that's what you'll notice a lot whenever they bring up DeShaun Watson. They'll have they'll frame these questions in a way to force a result. And the result they want to force you to say is, yeah, he was along for the ride. Or, yeah, he was okay, but I don't know. I don't really want to talk about him, right? That's what they want to force out. So just notice that. Keep an eye on that, because it's been something I've noticed, especially with the coverage of DeShaun Watson lately.
Contract fully guaranteed, but I think that was the moment where you realize that the Browns traded for DeShaun to win those types of football games and to make plays in the second half, particularly in the fourth quarter, being at his best when his best was required. In the fourth quarter, DeShaun was a perfect 7 for 7 passing, and he had a passing touchdown and 158.3 passer rating, which is absolutely perfect. Not to mention that he used his legs to convert for a couple of first downs, namely the one on the game-winning drive, which was really impressive. The fact that he was able to be such a playmaker down the stretch is what gave that team, gave that offense confidence, and that's the only thing that the Browns were missing. We talked about all the other elements that they had. Do you have a defense? Check. Do you have guys that can be difference makers in your skill position core? Check. Do you have a solid offensive line? Check. Do you trust your head coach in terms of X's and O's play design? Check. The only question was, do we have a quarterback that can make plays in tight ball games and will us to a win? And yesterday, that was an emphatic yes for the Cleveland Browns.
I think that it's a really reasonable, solid take by Chris Canty, right? I've talked about this. We know where this team can go. Quarterback's been the biggest question mark. Now, some of us have been more confident that that question mark was going to be answered, but none of us at any point, if we're being honest, did not think that the quarterback position was not a question mark for the Cleveland Browns. Like, it was coming into the season. It was longer into the season than we would have liked. Now we feel good about it. Like, we've seen them put together 3 games this season, pretty much back-to-back, right? Because Tennessee, 5-week break, and then he plays. Well, he did play in Indy, and it was not good, but he played 5. He threw the ball 5 times. It's hard to say that's a whole game. And then you saw this game, Arizona and Tennessee, and you're like, okay, I could see the signs of him getting better. And it's like, okay, Tennessee, Arizona, those aren't good teams. You played them at home. This is on the road versus one of the best, if not the best defense, not on your own team that you could play in the NFL. and you were able to pull it out in the fourth quarter by doing stuff that you do well, not just running it, but throwing it as well. So that is why we feel better about it, but it's still a question, right? Like I've said it. We want to see him put together like 8 good weeks, right? If we see him put together 8 good weeks, we fine, right? But that's really what we want to see to feel comfortable about it, because like we've seen 2 straight good weeks from him or something like that before. You want to see, if you're a Browns fan, 8 good weeks. And I think Chris Canty, that's an excellent point from him. And I thought that's a good take by him.
That was a signature win. That was a signature moment for him. But maybe I am being short-sighted here, but I'm still not convinced, because he did not play good the first half. He stepped up when it mattered, but to me, one half of football isn't going to be enough for me to be convinced that DeShaun Watson is the guy that they gave the contract to. I'm going to need to see it a little bit more consistently, but the second half of that game yesterday is a good start.
14 of
So back to what I was saying about framing, right? It's all about the framing. It's all about what you make your audience assume is true based on how you delivered what you said. Because again, most people watching this show probably did not watch the whole Browns-Ravens game. Only Browns and Raven fans, for the most part, watched that game. It was Sunday at 1 o'clock. So you get a lot of leeway with how you can portray these events. Now, I think that the narrative that DeShaun Watson had the worst first half in NFL history, or whatever people are trying to say about it now, it's a little bit overblown. I think if you watch the game, you'd be like, yeah, he wasn't playing great, but he wasn't bad. Like, he wasn't a detriment to the Cleveland Browns' success. He just wasn't making every play available to him like he did in the fourth quarter. But again, it's how you frame the event. Oh, yeah, 2 quarters of football isn't going to be enough to convince me. And look, I'm not saying that he has to convince you, but it's been more than 2 quarters. It's been 2 games back to back. You know, it was against the best defense in the AFC that he can play, because he's on the Browns. He can't play the Browns defense unless he's at practice. So it makes me wonder, was she this hesitant about crowning Brock Purdy earlier in the year, despite the fact that Brock Purdy didn't play an elite defense until he played the Cleveland Browns and then he crumbled? You know, because this same show, I remember, was on the Brock Purdy MVP train. And if you don't remember, Brock Purdy, at that point in time where they were on the Brock Purdy MVP train, had played a whopping 10 games in his NFL career. They lauded his record. I believe he was 10-0. He played 10 games. DeShaun's played 12. He's 8-4 as the Cleveland Browns. But we're framing it as if that does not exist. How many times have you heard? Like, I feel like I'm the only guy in NFL history to ever bring up what DeShaun Watson's record is as the Cleveland Browns starter. I feel like nobody else does that. Why doesn't that get brought up? Again, he's 8-4 as a starter for the Cleveland Browns overall, including the horrible 2022, right? That people like to act like the Browns just went winless in that run, not 500 versus good teams and beat a playoff team that year. You know, like, again, just we see how things are framed. And then you come back to this year, they're 5-1. They've beaten the Bengals, they beat the San Francisco 49ers with him, and they beat the Baltimore Ravens on the road. 2 of those games DeShaun Watson played in, and was a huge factor in both of those games, by the way. Division games against good opponents, good defenses, 2 top 10 defenses right there. Say what you want about Joe Burrow not showing up in that first game. The Bengals defense did, and DeShaun Watson did. But again, it's just 2 quarters. It's just 2 quarters. No, it's not just 2 quarters. It's the Cincinnati game. It's the Tennessee game. It's the 8-4 overall record that he has as a starter. It's the 5-1 record that he has this year. It's the point differential that the Cleveland Browns have when DeShaun Watson starts a game at quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, or at least starts and finishes a game at quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Those are the things that truly matter. And those have been really good. Never gets brought up here. Only 2 quarters, right? The 2 quarters ain't going to convince me. And I love how people talk about it as if a good first half performance is equal to a good second half performance. I'm sorry, but if DeShaun Watson would have balled out this first half and then had a bad second half, y'all wouldn't have let that shit go. Y'all would have said, I don't care what he does in the first half. You know that he has to show up when it matters the most, and that's when it matters. And when it mattered, he didn't show up. But all of a sudden, showing up when it matters is not as important, or is just as important as showing up in the first 2 quarters. Now, it's important to show up all 4 quarters, but not everybody does that every game. You see what I'm saying? How are we framing the first half and the second half as equivalent? What he did in winning time is just as important as what he did in the second quarter. You see how it's framed? This is what I mean. This is how you can tell. It's the framing, not what they're saying. They're going to always say stuff to make it appear as if they're being fair at times. And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But the framing, you got to watch the framing on stuff like this.
14 in that second half, 150 and a touchdown, and he was perfect, obviously, in that moment. I know, CC, even though there were all the passes, I know it was a run that stood out to you maybe more than any of the other passes, or equal to the passes with that first down scramble that he had late in that game for Watson, that he was doing finding ways, right? That's what you want your franchise quarterback to do. We're going to get into C.J. Strad. C.J. Stroud found a way yesterday, which was just amazing. We've seen guys like Mahomes and Rodgers and Brady find ways forever. Watson found a way yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, the team trailed for over 59 minutes in that game and found a way to come away with a win. I mean, that was the first time we've seen a team trail by double digits and trail for so long in a game and win a football game since 2000. That's a long time, but that just goes to show you the level of confidence that this team plays with when DeShaun Watson is at the helm. And say what you want about DeShaun, this team is 5-1 in the 6 starts that he's had. And so I think there's an element of confidence that he instills in the rest of that team because of his ability to do.
It's crazy. Me and Chris Canty, the only one know that stat. Nobody else bring it up.
At the end of the Ravens game yesterday, the fact that you have a quarterback that's capable of that, it gives you a little more bounce, especially as a guy on the defensive side of the ball. When you've gone out there with the likes of DTR and Phillip Walker or PJ Walker, whoever you want to call it, like this team had no margin for error. And yesterday, you saw a little bit of margin for error because even though they got down by double digits early in that game and could have went in the tank, DeShaun found a way to make plays. That defense found a way to make plays, and ultimately they were able to get a win.
Boom. Chris Canty, he's on fire today. You know, he's on fire. I haven't had the nicest things to say about him in the other iterations of this video, but I think he's doing a good job here. Not just because he's agreeing with me, but he's bringing up points that I ain't even thought of. Margin of error for this Browns team is wide open. Like that's how you know you have a good football team. Good football teams have wide margins of error, right? Bad football teams or teams that aren't as good as their record have very thin margins of error. Like something can't go wrong. Nothing can go wrong. We can't have no interceptions. We can't have no turnovers, right? That's how we had to play when we had Jacoby Brissett. That's how we kind of got away with it with PJ, but that's how you felt like the team had to be with Baker Mayfield or Like we couldn't have these errors. And then when you made those errors, they were backbreaking because you didn't think the team was that good. When you have a good team, you can make mistakes. And look, I don't know how much I don't know if you have more margin of error than what the Browns did on Sunday. They had plenty of mistakes in that game versus a good opponent on the road. They still won. Their margin of error is massive. That's a great point by Chris Canty. And that's how you can tell a team's really good.
Baltimore is a Super Bowl contender, but when y'all gonna let me know when it's okay to start worrying about these Lamar Jackson turnovers? When is it okay to start worrying about the Lamar Jackson turnovers? Because it's starting to become a thing now. Like, I'm just asking, Small. Since 2019, the guy got 12 fourth-quarter turnovers. That's the most in football. This year, he's got more turnovers than he has passing touchdowns. He's got 11 turnovers, 5 picks, 6 lost fumbles, to 10 passing touchdowns.
I think Chris Canty's cooking again. Hey, man, shout out to Chris Canty. What cooking today? I'm just watching the Chris Canty highlight reel right now. I can't believe it. But that's a good point. I bring it up all the time. I bring that point up all the time. When it talks about the Ravens. And I say, hey, look, Lamar Jackson is a killer. He's dominating. He can dominate the game. But the one thing about Lamar, you can get him to turn that ball over. Right? He is, I don't want to say turnover prone because you think of like a Daniel Jones or something like that when you say turnover prone. But he is somebody who is more, it feel like more like Phillip Rivers at times, right? Where Phillip Rivers is like, every once in a while, he'll give you one. Or even like a Peyton Manning used to just give you a turnover every once in a while, right? And that's kind of what DeShaun, that's the program he on. And every time I bring it up, I know Raven fans get mad at me, Quincy, and all this, you a hater, even though I'm one of the bigger supporters of DeShaun Watson, especially in this fan base for the Cleveland Browns. So, I think that they really need to acknowledge that the ball security with Lamar Jackson, like it's a thing. He fumbles the ball often in the pocket, way more often than you need to. And, he has a knack for some of these turnovers late in games at times because sometimes he gets too aggressive for his own good or tries to get too creative for his own good. You see it happen with Pat Mahomes in the regular season at times, and that happens with Lamar. And think about it like this, man. They were a defensive holding penalty away from having 3 interceptions in his game. So it could have been worse.
Are we ready to put Cleveland with Kansas City, Baltimore? If you want to put Jacksonville in the mix, which I understand after yesterday getting their butts kicked against the Niners, which to be fair, we all saw coming. Circumstances matter. 3 in a row loss.
Circumstances matter when it comes to the Jaguars. Hey, man, if only there were a team that when they played the 49ers at home, had the 49ers on the road. If only there were a team that was able to beat the 49ers with the backup quarterback, man. Like, I don't know, man. Maybe that team exists. I don't know. We be really ready to crown these other teams, but man, if we don't ever look at the resume for some, like I swear there was a team that did that this year. Y'all know who that was? Let me know in the comment section, man.
This is for San Francisco. 5 in a row in terms of the wins for Jacksonville. It just kind of, we knew that was going to happen.
San Francisco with some time off.
Yeah. So are we ready to put Cleveland as a Super Bowl contender?
We knew they were going to get beat down by San Francisco, but we still acted like they still in the elite team conversation. I'm sorry. If you ever tell yourself you're a team that won 5 in a row is going to lose automatically to a team that lost 3 games in a row, you do not believe that team is elite. Stop lying to yourself. If you truly looked at that Jacksonville 49ers game and said to yourself, yeah, Jags got no shot, I'm expecting a blowout, you don't think they're an elite team. Because that's not shit that happens to an elite team.
Out of the AFC?
Absolutely. If DeShaun Watson can play the rest of the season like he played in the second half, why wouldn't you put Cleveland in that conversation? We kept saying the defense was good enough to win them a championship, that they were a quarterback away. Well, in the second half, particularly the fourth quarter, they did not look like they were a quarterback away.
Okay, so they're in because you also said about that first half, right? That first half, that if you see more of that, then they're not a Super Bowl contender, obviously.
It's funny to me, man, because like Deshaun Watson's bad games truly like live longer than his good games, because it's like, oh yeah, if he plays like those 2 quarters, but boy, oh boy, those first 2, it is like, it'll never end, man. Like people will focus. He's had 6 bad quarters this year. Like truly, all of this bitching and moaning about Deshaun Watson, the contract, and everything else that we've heard this year, all of this crying about, oh, was it the worst quarter? All of this shit is over 4 bad quarters. 6 if you include this game. And I don't even think the 2 that they added in here is valid. Like he wasn't good. He was just aight. Quarterbacks have aight quarters all the time. But we doing this off 6 bad quarters on a guy who has a 5-1 record, who has been playing winning football. And I understand he's not in the MVP kind of conversation like everybody else like thought he could be in, or there was a chance because he was in 2020. I understand that. But come on, man. Why we acting like everything else does not exist? Like only those 6 quarters in like we act like he's played 2 games. It's been 6 quarters in Baltimore, with a 6 quarters plus the 2 in Baltimore, and then the 2 quarters at the end of this game. Like no, he stacked together 2 good games and then put that together, and he's had 4 good games on it. He's been much better than he's been not this whole year. He was good against Cincinnati. He was bad against Pittsburgh. He was good. He was great against Tennessee. Thought he was pretty damn good against the Arizona Cardinals. And he was pretty damn good for when it mattered versus the Baltimore Ravens. We doing all this questioning and uncertainty over what? a bad game in Pittsburgh. That's it. That's the only thing to justify it this year. But that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.